Hollywood is in complete shock tonight, after what insiders are calling the most explosive culture clash in late-night television history. Mark Wahlberg, the Boston-born actor and producer known for his working-class roots and no-nonsense attitude, was forcibly removed from The Late Show with Stephen Colbert following a heated altercation that exposed the toxic divide between authentic street credibility and performative intellectualism. What should have been a routine promotional appearance turned into a career-defining moment that revealed the contempt coastal elites have for working-class success stories. Make sure you smash that subscribe button because this story contains exclusive behind-the-scenes details that will make you understand the real cultural war happening in Hollywood. The shocking truth about what happens when genuine transformation meets intellectual snobbery goes deeper than anyone imagined. And we've got insider information that reveals the calculated attack on working-class values, disguised as sophisticated commentary. According to sources close to the production, Mark Wahlberg had been reluctant to appear on Colbert's show for months, sensing that the Yale-educated host looked down on actors who didn't come from prestigious backgrounds. But his team had convinced him that Stephen's show would provide the perfect platform for discussing his latest project, and perhaps inspiring viewers who had overcome their own difficult circumstances. Mark was genuinely hesitant about going on Colbert, revealed a longtime member of Wahlberg's inner circle who witnessed the devastating aftermath. He'd heard stories about how Stephen treats guests who don't fit his intellectual image, especially working-class guys who made good. But his publicist convinced him that Stephen had evolved, that he'd be respectful of Mark's journey from the streets of Dorchester to Hollywood success. The warning signs started appearing during the pre-interview coordination process, but they were disguised as Stephen's supposed interest in Mark's fascinating background. His producers seemed unusually focused on Mark's troubled youth, his past legal issues, and what they described as his transformation narrative, terms that should have been red flags for anyone familiar with how elite media treats working-class success stories. They kept asking for details about Mark's criminal past, his time in jail, his gang affiliations, explained a publicist familiar with the booking process. They claimed they wanted to showcase his redemption story, how he'd overcome adversity to become successful. We thought it was Stephen being genuinely interested in second chances and personal growth. Behind the scenes, crew members described an atmosphere that felt more like preparation for a sociological experiment than a celebrity interview. Stephen was reportedly obsessing over Mark's background, studying police reports and court documents with the kind of intensity usually reserved for investigative journalism rather than entertainment television. Stephen had this whole research file about Mark's arrests, his assault charges, even stuff about his family's struggles with addiction, recalled a production assistant who witnessed the disturbing preparations. But he wasn't studying it to understand Mark's journey or celebrate his transformation. He was looking for ways to make him look like he hadn't really changed, like success hadn't made him any less of a street thug. What made the situation even more volatile was Stephen's well-documented pattern of intellectual condescension toward celebrities who didn't attend elite universities or come from privileged backgrounds. Industry insiders reveal that the late-night host has a history of treating working-class actors as curiosities to be examined rather than equals to be respected. Stephen has this thing about people who succeeded without following the traditional path, explained a former show writer who left after becoming uncomfortable with the host's increasingly elitist attitudes. Mark represents everything Stephen can't understand, someone who made it despite having every disadvantage, someone whose authenticity makes Stephen's manufactured persona look fake. He sees guys like Mark as threats to his intellectual authority. The tension escalated when Mark arrived at the studio, bringing his characteristic intensity and genuine pride in how far he'd come from his troubled beginnings. Witnesses describe the actor as being cautiously optimistic about the interview, hoping to discuss his latest film, and maybe inspire kids who were facing the same challenges he'd overcome in Boston. But Stephen's behavior during their pre-show meeting immediately, set off alarm bells among staff who understood both men's personalities. Mark was being his usual straight-talking self, sharing stories about his kids and his faith, talking about how grateful he was for second chances, observed a stage manager who's facilitated hundreds of celebrity interviews. But Stephen was responding with these weird academic questions about cycles of violence and socio-economic factors, like he was studying Mark instead of talking to him as a human being. Behind closed doors, makeup artists and wardrobe staff noticed that Stephen kept making subtle digs about Mark's Boston accent, his working-class expressions, and what he called his fascinating linguistic patterns. The condescension was thinly veiled as intellectual curiosity, but everyone could see it was really cultural snobbery disguised as sophistication. Stephen kept making these comments about Mark's colorful background and asking if he ever missed. The authenticity of street life revealed a makeup artist who worked with both men. Mark was trying to be polite, but you could see him getting irritated with being treated like some kind of zoo exhibit. Stephen was clearly fascinated by him, but not in a respectful way. The backstage atmosphere grew increasingly tense as showtime approached. Mark, with his natural sensitivity to condescension honed by years of fighting for respect in Hollywood, began picking up on Stephen's barely concealed contempt for his background. Meanwhile, Stephen was reportedly making final preparations for what crew members later described as a systematic deconstruction of Mark's transformation narrative. "You could feel the class warfare building," described an audience coordinator, who helped seat guests before the taping. Stephen was planning to put Mark in his place, to show that beneath the Hollywood success was still just a thug from Boston. Mark could sense it, and anyone who knows Boston guys knows that's exactly the wrong approach to take. As the cameras prepared to roll and Mark took his position with characteristic Boston swagger, production assistants were already expressing concern about what they feared was about to happen. The collision between Mark's authentic working class pride and Stephen's intellectual elitism was about to create a television moment that would expose the cultural divide tearing America apart. Nobody could have predicted just how viciously Stephen would attack someone's journey from the streets to success, or how explosively Mark would respond when his transformation was questioned by someone who had never fought for anything. What unfolded next will be remembered as one of the most shocking displays of elite condescension in television history. As the cameras rolled and Stephen delivered his opening monologue, viewers immediately sensed something predatory in his demeanor, the calculated smugness of someone preparing to intellectually dissect a person whose authentic success story threatened his carefully constructed worldview. When he introduced Mark Wahlberg, his tone carried an undercurrent of barely concealed contempt that made everyone who understands class warfare sick to their stomachs. "Please welcome a man who's had quite the journey from the mean streets of Boston to the glamorous hills of Hollywood, Mark Wahlberg." The introduction was loaded with condescending undertones that immediately signaled this wasn't going to be a celebration of one of America's most inspiring transformation stories. When Mark walked onto the stage with his characteristic Boston's confidence and genuine pride in his journey, the contrast between his authentic success and Stephen's manufactured intellectual superiority was disturbing to witness. The interview began with seemingly standard questions about Mark's latest film, but viewers who understand elite manipulation could see Stephen laying elaborate traps with surgical precision. Mark, with his natural straightforwardness and assumption that others operated with similar honesty, responded with the kind of authentic passion that has made him beloved by working-class audiences worldwide. "You know, Mark, you have this incredible backstory," Stephen said with a smile that looked more like a clinical examination. "From gang member to movie star, it's really quite a fascinating sociological case study. Tell us about that transformation. How does someone go from, well, let's say criminal activity, to being a respected Hollywood producer?" The way Stephen emphasized criminal activity and described Mark's life as a case study was like a verbal assault disguised as intellectual curiosity. He had reduced Mark's painful journey from addiction and violence to success and redemption into an academic exercise, treating him like a specimen to be analyzed rather than a human being to be respected. Mark's face flickered with the first signs of irritation as he processed the condescending framing. "Well, Stephen," he replied with controlled intensity, "I wouldn't call it a case study. I'd call it a guy who made mistakes, took responsibility, and worked his ass off to become better. It's not sociology, it's life." The response was pure Mark, direct, honest, and rejecting the academic framework Stephen was trying to impose on his lived experience. Any decent person would have respected this perspective and engaged with Mark's actual journey. But Stephen Colbert isn't interested in actual journeys, and what he did next revealed his true contempt for working-class authenticity. "Life, absolutely," Stephen said with mock agreement that made several audience members shift uncomfortably. "Though I have to wonder, and forgive me for being intellectually curious here, but don't you think there's something almost performative about this whole redemption narrative? I mean, the religious conversion, the family man image, the charity work. It's all very convenient for someone trying to rebrand themselves from their criminal past." The studio fell into uncomfortable silence. Stephen had just suggested that Mark's faith, his commitment to his family, and his charitable work were all calculated image management rather than genuine transformation. The cruel implication that his entire life's journey was fake hit the air like a physical blow to everyone who had ever struggled to overcome their past. Mark's eyes flashed with something that made veteran crew members instinctively step back. Those who knew Boston knew that look. It was the moment before a storm that could level buildings. "Performative?" he said quietly, his voice carrying the edge that comes from someone whose authenticity has been questioned by someone who wouldn't last 5 minutes in his old neighborhood. Stephen, apparently energized by having struck a nerve, doubled down with the kind of intellectual cruelty that defines coastal elites. "Well, let's examine the timeline, shall we? The arrests, the violence, the hate crimes, and then suddenly, right when you need to clean up your image for Hollywood, there's this convenient transformation. The born-again Christianity, the devoted father act, the charity work with at-risk youth. It's almost too perfect, isn't it?" The attack on Mark's faith and his work with kids was breathtaking in its calculated viciousness. Stephen had just dismissed decades of genuine spiritual growth and community service as an act, suggesting that Mark's efforts to help other troubled youth were somehow fraudulent. Those sitting close to the stage could see Mark's hands clenching as he processed the attack on everything he held sacred. "Stephen," he said, his Boston accent thickening with controlled fury, "are you questioning my faith? Are you suggesting that my love for my kids is fake? Because if that's what you're doing, we're going to have a problem." But Stephen wasn't interested in backing down or showing respect for Mark's boundaries. He was interested in intellectual domination, and he wasn't finished with his systematic destruction of everything Mark represented. "Problem? Oh, I don't want any problems, Mark. I'm just trying to understand the psychology behind such dramatic life changes. From someone who studies these things academically, it's fascinating how people can reinvent themselves when the stakes are high enough." The reference to his academic perspective, while dismissing Mark's lived experience, was the epitome of elite condescension. Stephen was essentially arguing that his Yale education made him more qualified to analyze Mark's life than Mark himself, treating decades of real struggle and growth as data points in an intellectual exercise. The audience was growing visibly uncomfortable, realizing they were witnessing something far beyond typical late-night banter. This was cultural warfare, privileged intellectualism attacking authentic working-class transformation with surgical precision. Mark sat perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, his famous intensity building as he realized he wasn't dealing with someone interested in genuine conversation, but with someone who saw his entire life story as fodder for intellectual superiority games. When he finally spoke, His voice carried the controlled power of someone whose authenticity had been attacked by someone who had never earned anything through real struggle. "You know what, Stephen?" he said slowly, his voice getting quieter, but somehow more dangerous. "I've been sitting here listening to you turn my life into some kind of academic experiment. But here's the thing. You don't know shit about where I come from or what I've been through." The rebuke hung in the air like a declaration of war, and for a moment it seemed like Stephen might realize he had pushed too far. But instead of showing any trace of respect, he made the mistake that would trigger the most explosive confrontation in late-night television history. What happened next will be remembered as one of the most spectacular displays of Boston fury, demolishing intellectual arrogance in television history. Stephen's dismissal of Mark's lived experience as academic fodder was the match that lit the fuse of decades of working-class frustration with elite condescension. When Mark Wahlberg finally exploded, it was with the full force of Dorchester Street justice meeting Yale pretension in a collision that would destroy careers. "Don't know shit? Well, that's certainly colorful language," Stephen said with a condescending smirk that revealed his complete tone deafness to the danger he was in. "Though I have to say, that kind of reaction sort of proves my point about whether you've really moved beyond your, let's call them origins. The anger is still there, isn't it, Mark? Just beneath that Hollywood polish?" The suggestion that Mark's justified response to intellectual bullying was evidence that he hadn't really changed was the nuclear bomb that detonated every ounce of Boston pride in his DNA. Mark shot up from his chair with such explosive force that Stephen actually jerked backward, his smug expression finally cracking as he realized he had unleashed something beyond his comprehension. "Origins?" Mark's voice started building with the kind of dangerous energy that had once made him legendary on the streets of Boston. "You want to talk about my origins, Stephen? My origins are getting up at 4 a.m. to work construction jobs to help feed my family. My origins are watching my friends die from overdoses while privileged kids like you were playing with trust funds at Yale." The studio was in complete chaos. This wasn't the media-trained Mark Wahlberg Hollywood was used to seeing. This was pure, unfiltered Boston street justice from someone whose authenticity had been attacked by someone who had never fought for anything real in his life. Security personnel immediately moved closer, but they seemed uncertain about their role in what was clearly a cultural reckoning. Stephen, clearly in over his head, attempted to regain control with nervous laughter. "Mark, hey, let's take it down a notch here. We're on television. Maybe we should keep this civilized? You're proving exactly what I was talking about with the anger issues. Civilized?" Mark's voice reached levels that seemed to shake the entire Ed Sullivan Theater. "You call questioning my faith civilized? You call treating my life like a sociology experiment civilized? Let me tell you what's not civilized, Stephen. It's a privileged Yale boy who's never thrown a punch in his life lecturing me about anger management." By now, the show's executive producer had rushed onto the stage, desperately trying to manage a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. But Mark was in full Boston mode now, channeling decades of working-class fury at intellectual elites who looked down on people who had actually lived through real struggle. "You know what your problem is, Stephen," Mark continued, his legendary intensity now focused like a blowtorch on his target. "You think your fancy education makes you better than people who learned life lessons in the streets. You think reading books about struggle is the same as actually living it. Well, let me educate you about something they don't teach at Yale." The audience was transfixed by the raw power and authenticity pouring from the stage. This wasn't just a celebrity outburst. This was working-class America finally fighting back against coastal elite condescension. A man defending not just himself, but everyone who had ever been looked down on for their background. Stephen, his face now pale and sweating, made another desperate attempt to salvage his intellectual superiority. "Education, exactly. That's what I'm talking about. The ability to analyze and understand complex social dynamics instead of just reacting emotionally to everything. Some of us prefer to think before we think. Mark's voice reached such heights that light fixtures seemed to vibrate. You think I don't think, Stephen? I think about how to turn a $20 million budget into a $100 million movie. I think about how to create jobs for working class crews. I think about how to help kids avoid the mistakes I made. What do you think about? How to make people feel small for your entertainment. The accusation of using intellectual superiority to diminish others hung in the air like a judgment on everything Stephen represented. Several audience members were openly supporting Mark now, recognizing authentic passion defending itself against a manufactured intellectualism. Jimmy, clearly realizing his career was imploding, made one final desperate attempt to maintain control. "Security!" he called out frantically. "We need to get this under control. Mark's clearly having some kind of breakdown here." The suggestion that Mark's justified fury was a mental health crisis was the final insult that sent the Boston native into the stratosphere of righteous rage. Mark turned toward Stephen with such intensity that the host actually pushed his chair back from his desk. "Breakdown?" Mark's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than his shouting. "The only breakdown here is your pathetic attempt to use your fake intellectual authority to tear down someone who actually earned their success. You want to see a breakdown, Stephen? Look in the mirror at what happens when privilege meets reality." The studio had fallen into absolute silence, everyone understanding they were witnessing something that transcended entertainment. This was authentic American values confronting coastal elite snobbery in the most direct way possible. "You know what the difference is between us, Stephen?" Mark continued, his voice gaining power with every word. "I came from nothing and built something real. You came from everything and built a career tearing down people who remind you that you never earned anything the hard way." By now, security was actively moving toward the stage, but Mark's obvious moral authority and the audience's clear support made them hesitant to treat him as anything other than someone defending himself against intellectual abuse. "Mr. Wahlberg," the head of security said carefully, approaching like someone trying to calm a rightfully angry person, "we need you to please—" "Don't!" Mark whirled around, his eyes blazing with Boston fire that made the security chief step backward. "Don't you dare try to manage me for defending my family, my faith, and my journey. This man invited me here and then attacked everything I am. I have every right to respond to that." Stephen, in a moment of panic that would define his downfall forever, made one last attempt to maintain his intellectual narrative. "This is exactly what I mean about not really changing," he said desperately. "The violence, the anger, the inability to handle sophisticated discussion. You can take the man out of Dorchester, but—" That incomplete sentence about not being able to take Dorchester out of the man was the final straw that unleashed Mark's most devastating response. "You're damn right you can't take Dorchester out of me," he roared. "Dorchester taught me to work for everything I have. Dorchester taught me to stand up to bullies. And Dorchester taught me that respect is earned, not given. Something you clearly never learned at your fancy school." As security finally moved in, Mark delivered his crushing final blow. "The difference between me and you, Stephen, is that I'm proud of where I come from. You're just embarrassed by what you've become." And with that devastating assessment echoing through the silent studio, Mark Wahlberg walked off the stage with his head held high, leaving behind a humiliated host and the most powerful defense of working-class authenticity ever captured on television. The fallout from Mark Wahlberg's explosive exit began before he even reached the studio door. Within minutes, cell phone footage from outraged audience members was exploding across every social media platform on Earth, despite CBS Security's frantic attempts to contain what they knew was a career-ending disaster. By the time Mark had left the building, still radiating the working-class pride that comes from standing up to elite condescension, Mark Was Right was trending globally with over 220 million views in the first 4 hours alone, making it the most-watched confrontation between authentic America and coastal elitism in Internet history. What happened backstage in those crucial moments has been described by witnesses as both inspiring and deeply moving. Mark wasn't out of control when he got to his dressing room, revealed a crew member who comforted the actor. He was crystal clear about what had just happened. He kept saying, "That guy thinks he's better than everyone who didn't go to Yale, and someone had to call out that elitist garbage." Even in his fury, he was thinking about all the working-class people who get talked down to by people like Stephen every day. Meanwhile, Stephen sat alone on his destroyed stage as the studio audience filed out in unprecedented solidarity with Mark. Unlike previous incidents, people weren't just disappointed. They were genuinely angry at witnessing an attack on working-class values and authentic transformation. Several audience members actually confronted Stephen on their way out, with one shouting, "Mark Wahlberg is more of a man than you'll ever be." The comment would later become a viral video with over 120 million views. Behind closed doors at CBS, emergency meetings were already declaring the end of Stephen's credibility with mainstream America, as executives realized they were facing the most catastrophic cultural incident in network history. "This wasn't just bad publicity," disclosed a network insider who witnessed the executive panic firsthand. This was Stephen revealing himself as exactly the kind of coastal elite snob that half of America already suspected he was. He had just attacked the American dream itself, the idea that someone can overcome their past and become successful through hard work. But the real earthquake came when Mark's representatives released a statement that united working-class America against Stephen Colbert. Unlike typical Hollywood damage control, this response carried the moral weight of authentic struggle triumphing over manufactured intellectualism. "Mr. Wahlberg came tonight to discuss his latest project and share his story of transformation," the statement read. Instead, he was subjected to a calculated attack on his background, his faith, and his journey from the streets to success. What happened tonight represents the coastal elite's contempt for authentic American values and working-class achievement. The revelation that Stephen had deliberately targeted one of America's most inspiring success stories completely united every corner of working-class culture against him. Within hours, construction workers, police officers, firefighters, and ordinary Americans who had overcome their own struggles began expressing their outrage at what they had witnessed. "Defend working class" became a rallying cry that transcended entertainment into a full-scale cultural war against elite condescension. The response from working-class America was unprecedented in its speed and unanimity. Labor unions began publicly supporting Mark, while condemning Stephen's attack on the idea that people can genuinely change and succeed. What Stephen did was an attack on every working person who's ever tried to better themselves, said one union leader whose comment received 15 million likes within hours. Mark Wahlberg represents the American dream, overcoming adversity through hard work and faith. Mocking that journey is mocking America itself. Perhaps the most damaging response came from people whose lives paralleled Mark's journey. Former gang members who had turned their lives around, ex-convicts who had found redemption, and countless Americans who had overcome addiction and violence began sharing their stories in support of Mark. Their testimonials created a powerful narrative that Stephen had attacked not just one man, but the entire concept of second chances and personal transformation. The entertainment industry's response revealed a shocking cultural divide within Hollywood itself. While coastal elite celebrities remained largely silent, working-class actors, crew members, and behind-the-scenes workers began publicly supporting Mark's stance. "What Stephen did was disgusting," tweeted one respected character actor whose comment went viral. "Mark Wahlberg earned everything he has through blood, sweat, and genuine change. Stephen was born on third base and thinks he hit a triple." The ratings collapse was immediate and historically devastating. Stephen's show lost 95% of its audience in Heartland America within a week, with working-class viewers abandoning the program in unprecedented numbers. Major sponsors whose customer base included blue-collar Americans began pulling their advertising so rapidly that entire episodes had to be filled with generic network content. Industry analysts began calling it the Great American Exodus from elite entertainment. Meanwhile, Mark experienced something remarkable in his decades-long career: recognition as a spokesman for authentic American values who had successfully defended working-class dignity against intellectual snobbery. His social media following exploded as people discovered an actor who had handled elite condescension with the kind of authentic fury that resonated with millions of Americans who felt looked down upon by coastal elites. Mark showed us what real American strength looks like, posted one fan whose comment received 20 million likes. He didn't back down from some Yale snob who thinks he's better than people who work with their hands. Mark defended everyone who's ever been made to feel small by someone who inherited their position instead of earning it. The sentiment was echoed millions of times as working-class Americans shared their own stories of being condescended to by educated elites. The incident sparked what cultural historians are calling the Wahlberg moment, a national conversation about the divide between authentic American values and coastal elite pretension. Trade schools began using Mark's response as an example of standing up for working-class dignity. Business programs analyzed Stephen's tactics as a case study in how intellectual arrogance can destroy credibility with mainstream audiences. 2 years later, the consequences have reshaped both entertainment culture and Stephen's career permanently. The Late Show remains on the air, but Stephen has become a pariah in working-class America and has lost all credibility as someone who understands or respects ordinary Americans. His attack on authentic transformation is cited as the moment when coastal elitism revealed its true contempt for American values. No working-class organization will associate with him, and his political commentary is now viewed through the lens of his attack on someone who embodied the American dream. Mark, meanwhile, has been elevated to iconic status as someone who successfully defended working-class authenticity against elite condescension. He's received honors from labor organizations. His films have gained renewed support from audiences who see him as one of their own, and his production company has become known for creating opportunities for working-class crews and telling authentic American stories. Sometimes you have to stand up not just for yourself, but for everyone who shares your values, he said in his only extended comment about the incident during a recent film premiere in Boston. When some privileged snob attacks where you come from, you defend it, because millions of good people come from the same place. The Mark Wahlberg versus Stephen Colbert showdown will be remembered as the moment when authentic American values triumphed over coastal elite snobbery, when working-class dignity defeated intellectual condescension, and when one man's journey from the streets to success was defended against someone who had never earned anything the hard way. It proved that attacking the American dream will always backfire, and that genuine transformation will always be more powerful than manufactured sophistication. What did you think about this explosive clash between working-class authenticity and elite condescension? Was Stephen's attack on Mark's journey the moment he lost mainstream America forever? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Smash that subscribe button for more shocking celebrity revelations, and hit that notification bell so you never miss the stories that expose the cultural war between real Americans and coastal elites.